Just before I go into the sermon message, I pray that we all will use this time of staying in during this pandemic as a time to reflect, as a time to examine, as a time to align ourselves with the will and the mind of God. In the next 2 Sundays, I plan to deal with 2 issues that we need to deal with, I think, as we go through this time of reflection. One will be dealing with the lies we hear, the lies we live, and the lies we envelop. And the other happens to be the gods we worship, the gods we follow, the gods that we project in our lives and in our culture. And that's important, for the Lord has told us straight out that there should be no other gods before him that we should serve or follow. But in so many ways, that's exactly what many of us in this nation have done. But today I want to deal with the topic of when all else has failed, then what? When all else has failed, then what? I'm going to ask again that you mute your mics if you would. When all else has failed, then what? Have you ever known a time in your life when all else has failed? Have you ever known a time in your life when you've had some area of your life to cripple you, some relationship or responsibility to crumble before your eyes? No, have you ever had some problem that seemingly resists solution or some challenge that you can't seem to meet? I know that all of us feel this way right now with the coronavirus pandemic. People of all ages are getting it and dying, and no vaccine is really in sight. And we seem to be at the mercy of that virus. Now, what do you do when all else fails? What do you do when your best efforts only seem to make things worse rather than better? Some of us have known this kind of feeling of failure in times of sickness. Others of us have felt it with people that we've sought to love and to help. Still others have felt it about their jobs or about their marriages, or sometimes even in our churches and their ineffectiveness. And when one looks at all of the people and ministries and programs that weigh heavily on our hearts, we cannot help but sometimes ask the question, what can you do when all else has failed? Well, I think the book and the prophet Ezekiel can give us some invaluable insights as to what we must remember and do when all else has seemingly failed. For Ezekiel was called to be a prophet to the people of God at a time when everything else had failed. For he was born around 621 BC, and in the first 27 years of his life, he lived through the spiritual and political decline of Judah and Jerusalem. No, he saw the glory of the temple desecrated as the golden decorations and furnishings were stripped away in a last-ditch effort to avert defeat by paying tribute to Babylonia. No, he witnessed the rise and fall of 4 of his kings as the Babylonian Empire took over world domination and made Judah a vassal state. Finally, around 597 BC, Ezekiel himself was carried off into exile in Babylonia, along with King Jehoiakim and the leading citizens and princes and craftsmen of Judah. During his first year in exile, Ezekiel both observed what happened to God's people and strongly empathized with them. And he noticed that although the Babylonians allowed the Jews of Judah to live in their own ethnic communities, he noticed that his people still could not forget their defeat and humiliation. And even worse, he noticed that his people had a very limited understanding of the God of Israel. For many of them felt that the power and sovereignty of their God was limited to the promised land and Jerusalem. No, many of them felt that to be exiled from Palestine was to be separated from the Lord. For they failed to see that the God of Israel was also the Lord of all creation. That's why the psalmist in that 137th verse, or 137th Psalm, in describing the dejection and humiliation and forsakenness that the people of Judah felt, wrote, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. And when our captors demanded of us songs, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion,' we replied, 'How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? For everything we know, everything we've tried, everything we hoped for, everything we believed in has failed.' And here, while in captivity amidst a humiliated and demoralized people, here, while being among the captives by the river Chebar in a foreign land, Ezekiel says that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God." No, in an atmosphere of depression and indignation and failure, Ezekiel says that the light of heaven broke through. No, in a state of dejection and bewilderment from his homeland, he says, "I saw visions of God." No, I saw the God of Israel. I saw the God of our fathers revealing himself and laying his hands upon me. And church, just this one verse tells us at least 4 or 5 things. For first of all, it tells us that God is not tied to geographic locations or monumental structures. His spirit cannot be contained in a building or harnessed by a nation or limited to a certain group or race of people. For when Ezekiel saw visions of God, he was not in the land of Judah, he was in the land of his captors. When Ezekiel saw visions of God, he was not in the temple of Jerusalem, he was by the river Chebar in the land of the Chaldeans. And church, this ought to tell us something. For whether it be in a palace or in a prison, whether it be in a dungeon or by the doorstep, whether it be at home or abroad, God can make his presence known to anyone at any time, anywhere. Even with this pandemic, we don't have to be in church to have church. And you know, it's often when we are at our lowest point and in strange situations when God will have the light of heaven to break through and make his presence known. I know for myself that the closest I ever felt to God was not in the picturesque sanctuary of my home church or in the midst of stained glass windows and pipe organs and chancel choirs. But the closest I ever felt to God was in a crowded dormitory in a single room on a rural campus in New Jersey, amidst the burning of crosses outside my door and the cries of warped minds and hateful hearts saying, "Niggers, go home." For it was there, amidst the cries of angered Klansmen and the smoke of burning crosses, that the Spirit of God came in my room and convicted my heart and gave me the assurance that his grace was upon me and his Spirit was within me and his protection was around me. And now that I think of it, it was there in that same dormitory 4 years later, away from family and friends, that God overshadowed me with his presence and let me know that my lips would preach his word and that my life would be used in his service. No, God is not tied to locations and places, for God is able to accomplish his will and deliver his people anywhere at any time. That's why I love that song that we often sing, that Jesus is on the main line, just tell him what you want. But then the second thing that comes out of this verse is that no place is so wicked that God cannot raise up folk to do his will. For whether it be in Babylon or in a barroom, whether it be on your job or in your home, whether it be in your parlor or in the prison, God is able to call whomever he may to do whatever he wills. Remember that Ezekiel was in Babylon when God called him to be a prophet unto a hurting and humiliated people. And God is still raising up prophets and witnesses in the bleakest of circumstances to accomplish his will. You know, back in 1973, I had the opportunity through a special invitation from the Roman Catholic Church to visit and dialogue with Christians behind what was then called the Iron Curtain in Poland. And I will always remember how while riding the train from West Germany into East Germany, the train was stopped and our visas were checked and our luggage was searched. And if any of us were carrying more than one Bible, we had to surrender it to the East German authorities. When we reached Poland, we noticed a number of things. First, we noticed that whatever mail had been sent to us, it had been opened before being delivered to us. Secondly, we noticed that whenever we would talk with the students or diplomats or citizens about life in Poland, they would be very cautious in what they said and who they said it around. And for those Christians we met and dialogued with in the rural areas, they made it plain that they served the Lord. They made it plain that they openly worshiped Christ at a tremendous cost. For those who were identified as Christians, they received the lowest positions of employment in their field. And they were often ridiculed and ostracized by their fellow countrymen. And they had to forego the few amenities that many of the citizens of Poland enjoyed. But what amazed me was that in the midst of all of that religious and political oppression, the churches I visited were packed. The prayer meetings that I attended were on fire. The faith and the perseverance shown by God's people in the midst of tyranny was fervent and strong. And that experience let me know that even in the most evil of circumstances, God can raise up a people to praise his name and do his will and spread his word. And this really shouldn't shock us as black folk, for even during slavery, when the backs of our forefathers were bent with pain, and when their ears were filled with nothing but the sounds of cracking whips and cursing taskmasters, they could still sing that up over my head I can hear music in the air. There must be a God somewhere. No, even when their feet were scratched by thorns and scorched by the heat of the ground, they could sing, I got shoes, you got shoes. All God's children got shoes. And when I get to heaven, I'm going to put on my shoes and walk all over God's heaven. And why were our foreparents able to do what they did and bear what they bore? Why? Because in the midst of their evil oppression, God placed a song in their heart and hope in their souls and freedom on their minds. And he let them know that he would still be their refuge and strength and help in the time of trouble. And as it was then, so it is today. For God is still the strength of our lives. God is still our sun and our shield. No place is so wicked that God cannot raise up and support and sustain his people. And if he does not raise folk up, he'll make our enemies into our footstools. But then thirdly, we can get something else from this verse. Whether godly or wicked, whether saint or sinner, misfortune and hard times, persecution and troubles, and even pandemics can and will come our way. Ezekiel had not personally done anything so horrendous or so immoral to warrant his being held captive in a foreign land. But he was part of a race of people that was taken into captivity by the Babylonian Empire primarily because of their sins. And as they were deported, he was deported. And church, the same calamities that others are exposed to, the same diseases that others have to face with, we're exposed to too. And as long as we are on planet Earth and part of the human race and part of a fallen world, we're always going to be subject to heartache and pain and strife. No, if a person enters a home where someone has a contagious disease, they run the risk of catching it. It makes no difference why they're in that house. They may be a doctor, they may be a burglar, they may be good, they may be bad, but those disease germs cannot tell the difference. And likewise, tornadoes and floods and earthquakes and malignant tumors and pandemics, they have no consciences. That's why we need to stop oftentimes questioning or cursing God when illnesses and heartaches and other problems come our way. Instead, we need to trust in God, realizing that he is able to hear our cries and heal our afflictions, that he's able to supply our needs and to bring us through. For whether we realize it or not, the eternal God is our refuge, and underneath are his everlasting arms. But then there's a fourth thing that we can pick up from this text, and that's the fact that God has a special care for his people. That's why in all of their disillusionment, he raised up a prophet from among them to declare his word and to raise their hopes. And church, even as we witness the foundations of our families and schools and even our criminal justice system crumble sometimes before our eyes, like the psalmist David, we must decide that only in the Lord put I my trust. For you see, when everything else seems to fail, the only way that you can keep your sanity, the only way that you can bear your burdens, the only way that you can overcome your predicaments is if you place your trust in God. But you see, if you try to place your trust even during this pandemic in the government, you're going to be bewildered because Congress is oftentimes in gridlock. If you try to place it in our president, he doesn't know what he's doing. Matter of fact, if you listen to him, he'll kill all of you. If you try to turn to your friends, no matter how tried and true they are, they're going to get tired of you after a while, for they've got problems of their own. No matter what's facing you, if you turn even to your family, many of them are here today and gone tomorrow. Even if you have unlimited resources like money, though folks like to say that money talks, I've yet to see or hear of money stopping cancer or stopping heartaches or stopping suffering or stopping this pandemic. No, only in God can you trust. For only God can take feeble bodies and make them whole. Only God can take troubled hearts and bring comfort and joy. Only God can take threatening enemies and make them into your footstool. Only God can take impossible situations and show you the opportunities amidst the obstacles. Only God can bring you through a pandemic like the one that we're going through right now. That's why that songwriter was right when he wrote those words that I must tell Jesus all of my trials, for I cannot bear these burdens alone. But in my distress, he kindly will help me, for he ever loves and cares for his own. But there's a fifth thing that also we can get as we read that text. And that's the fact that God moves in a mysterious way. Notice in verse 4, it tells us that after the word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel, he saw a whirlwind coming out of the north, and a great cloud with raging fire engulfing itself. And church, something you need to realize is that storms and clouds were often associated with appearances of God. And what the Lord wanted was to let Ezekiel and those he was to write to know that in the midst of their suffering, God was still in control. That God was riding upon the storm, mighty and omnipotent. You know, approximately 28 years ago, my aunt Dorcas and her 2 children and 3 grandchildren that were living with her, they smelled smoke outside of their window. And when they got up and looked out their window, they saw fire engines up and down the block. And when they looked to their right window, they saw the house that was right next to them totally immersed in flames. And as they quickly rounded up all of the children and grabbed their overcoat and ran out into the street, tears were streaming down my aunt's face. For all of her life's belongings were in that house. All she accumulated in clothes and furniture and jewelry, as well as pictures and photographs of other family members, they were all in that house. And as she saw the house next door burn and how the wind was blowing at that time, she knew which house was next, her house. And she went into serious prayer. As a matter of fact, she cried out, "Oh God, save our home." Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, a strong north wind blew. And as that wind blew, it blew back the flames that were coming to her house, back onto the house that was already demolished. Here we can see how God moved in a mysterious way. That's why I can tell you that when everything else seemingly is for naught, when everything else seems to fail, don't give up, but hold on. No, when misfortune comes your way, don't give up, but hold on and let God guide your footsteps. When illness overtakes you, don't let go, but stretch out and let the Lord be your help. When friends forsake you, don't fall apart, but cling on and let God pick you up. No, when life seems to be getting you down, don't give up. For you see, with God by our sides, we might seem beaten, but will never be broken. With God by our sides, we might be knocked down, but will never be knocked out. With God by our sides, we might feel lonely, but will never be forsaken. That's why I love that song that says, "To be not dismayed, whate'er betide, God will take care of you. For beneath his wings of love abide, God will take care of you. For God will put healing in your body. God will open doors that no man can shut. God will make ways that are seemingly blocked. And God will help us to come through and overcome this pandemic." Amen. Amen. God bless you.